Hello, everyone. It's been a pleasure to be on this 3-day journey with you all. Tonight is the conclusion of the Revitalization of the Collective Soul lecture series. Thank you again for being here and supporting the work and contributing in your own ways out in the world. Tonight we will be discussing the work of alchemy, what exactly it was that the alchemists were up to in those esoteric little labs of theirs, and why Carl Jung was so fascinated with the work that they were doing. So the title of this lecture is The Mysterium Conjunctionis and the Individuation Process. The Mysterium Conjunctionis is the outcome of the alchemical procedure, where the hopelessly disparate opposites find the chain that unites them and they come together. Mysterium Conjunctionis. And the individuation process was coined by Carl Jung, which is simply the process of becoming yourself. And not just becoming your own little limited identification with yourself, but of course the big S, capital S, self, becoming yourself. And so we're going to be continuing some threads that we've been weaving throughout these 3 days. We're going to be still talking about the Newtonian Cartesian paradigm and how it writes off anything that doesn't really make rational sense and sees it as either a fantasy of primitive process, a way to escape death, primarily when it comes to inhabiting the witness that was never born, therefore can never die, and how coming back into union with all of these disparate parts of ourselves, not just the ones that are very obvious to us, but the ones that are perhaps hidden and dark, and that the obvious ones themselves are perhaps not so obvious. But before we delve into that, I wanted to kind of pull a loose thread that I left yesterday, which was the role of sacred medicine in being able to help us see the various stages that we might be able to work in our normal state of consciousness, i.e., we can glimpse psychedelic states, or we can glance transcendent states. And once we glance those, we're able to kind of have a footing or a place to go, a direction to move towards when we're doing our own inner work. Because certain things are not always appreciable. For me, I could never understand, or I never knew what unconditional love felt like in my body. And that's something that sacred medicine was able to show me. And I wouldn't say that I've solidified that in my being quite yet, but I'm a lot better than I was, say, 5 years ago. And so that's the role that they play. They open the aperture between the conscious and the unconscious. The distinction between self and other ego and self starts to evaporate, and we experience ourselves as deeper and deeper minutiae of the universe, as well as grander and grander and broader elements of the universe, such to the point where we can't even identify with the witness itself and recognize or see the dualities begin to collapse, where seer and seen are both the same. So what was it the alchemists were up to? What were they doing? When viewed from our current understanding, our current empirical scientific understanding, it seems like they were up to these weird little experiments in their own little isolated caverns. And the juxt of what they were doing was that they were trying to turn lead into gold. And we take a very materialist viewpoint on that, of like, oh, well, they were trying to make something really valuable out of something abundant. Or they were trying to create something beautiful out of something heavy and poisonous, which is indeed what they were trying to do. But because we're looking at it from our lens of materia, of defining lead and gold as PB, AU elements on the periodic table, were losing the essence of what it was that they were up to. So the alchemists lived in a time and place in a medieval worldview where the distinction between matter and spirit had not yet been defined. And so all of these substances they were working with had their own sort of essence to them, or their own sort of spirit. So lead was not the chemical element Pb to them that we were centuries off from that definition. Lead itself was a very heavy element, was associated with melancholia, with sadness, with depression, and with madness, because of course you can go crazy from lead poisoning. Whereas gold had this sort of same essence to it. It was the shining, bright, immutable, right? Because gold doesn't react with many things. It's already perfect in this way. And so what the alchemists were trying to do was turn the lead of their souls into gold. And the reason why they were doing this is because they were living in a time and place very much dominated by the church. And the church dictate was that the work of Christ is complete. You need only believe in the salvation of Jesus Christ and your soul will be saved. Heaven is nowhere here on the earth. It comes after you die. And so if you live a good life here, and you keep your head low, and you obey, you be a good serf, you serve the king and the queen, and you don't do anything to hurt anybody, then you can go to heaven. But the alchemists were not so convinced by this. To them, because there was so much suffering still taking place in the world, they committed a grand heresy and posited that the work of Christ actually was not complete and that it had to be taken up within the realm of each individual human soul. And so they set out on a quest. Because this was heresy, they had to keep their work secret. And whenever they did communicate with each other, which was rare, they did so in very cryptic texts. So there were many isolated incidents of people working alone. And what was fascinating about all of this was that they were starting to come to very similar conclusions about how do you attain wholeness, how does the work of Christ become complete within the human soul. And what's more, a psychiatrist in the 20th century, Dr. Carl Jung, stumbled upon this imagery, and he noticed that the dreams of his patients were bringing this imagery to the fore. And so he thought to himself, how is it possible that people living in the 20th century who have no idea or interest in what alchemy is are having these kind of hermeneutic imageries appear in their dreams? And so this is what we've been talking about over the last 3 days, is that there is this very discrete, conscious, linguistic part of ourselves, and then there is an image-making part of ourselves that speaks in images, that speaks in feelings and body sensations, that speaks in all these other different kinds of language that exists prior to the time that we are born, that keeps on going after we die, and is infinitely intelligent, and uses this imagery to speak to us in a myriad of ways. And so this is the kind of advantage, if you will, of the image-making part of our psyche. This versus that. Here you see this is the alchemical procedure and its total. You have these various opposites here: male, female, masculine, feminine, mythical, real, quote unquote real, the primate in the middle, beholding the world, the animus mundi. And each is holding the staff of Mercurius. Mercury, another one of these elements that the alchemists were very drawn to because of its dual nature as a metal and a liquid, and also its ability to inspire madness should you work with it too often. And here you can see each member of the pair, the male figure pointing up, female figure pointing down. Male towards spirit, feminine towards earth, body, salt, another component. So the three principal substances that the alchemists were concerned with, besides the allegory of lead into gold, was salt, body, earth, Mercury, the mercurial spirit, the shapeshifter, the conundrum, the thing that kind of unites its opposites together, and then sulfur, which is very much tied to the element of fire. And we'll distinguish between true and false sulfur as we start to get into the alchemical procedure. And so it's kind of funny that we've been talking about the Newtonian Cartesian paradigm, because Isaac Newton was himself very fascinated with alchemy, and actually probably would not ascribe to the paradigm that now bears his name in part. And one of the central cult leaders of the religion known as scientism, Neil deGrasse Tyson, if you watch the series Cosmos, which is a fantastic series, he will discuss Newton and say, but yeah, he wasted all this time on things like alchemy and finding codes in the Bible. But where Newton failed in his studies and inquiry of alchemy, Carl Jung got very far and knew that there was something. What he said was that essentially the alchemists had stumbled upon an empirical investigation of the psyche as such, that they were working with it in a very hands-on and naked way. So whenever they were working with their substances, whenever they were heating up the elements and they were distilling them and they were cycling through them, it wasn't a purely physical process as we might watch in the lab today. For them, this was also a very intensely psychological and emotional process. They were projecting their own soul, they were projecting their own emotions onto what was happening in their lab. And right here is the blueprint for how to do all of this, or what we should be aiming towards. All of the alchemical texts, or all of the images that come through, have some element of this union of solar and lunar, masculine and feminine, combining into a hermaphroditic spirit, resting upon a bestial nature, symbolized by the dragons, and winged, like the eagles here. So comprising this very chthonic, dark element, and this very spiritual, soaring aspect. And the stages of alchemy, which we'll go into, the death, the negredo, the albedo, and the rubedo, is very much in line with the individuation process in Dr. Carl Jung's analytical psychology. And so let's talk a little bit about this handsome guy, Dr. Carl Jung. He's a Swiss psychiatrist, and he was the favorite disciple of Dr. Sigmund Freud. And he did his doctoral thesis on phenomenon of the occult, which is a very tricky thing to do in the early 1900s. And Freud was very conflicted about what he was doing. He wanted to make the practice of psychology be able to hold its weight within the modern scientific world. And we owe the legacy of calling it the unconscious, the id, the ego. These are all of his terms. And he was the first one to really take seriously the existence of an unconscious side of ourselves. But Carl Jung knew that there was something that lies beyond this, because especially in Freud's approach to dream work, everything was always a psychosexual conflict, you're trying to repress this element, and because you're repressing this element, it is finding its way to express in your dreams and your unconscious. For Freud, there was only a personal unconscious with Dr. Jung, where we see the first intonations in the Western canon of a collective unconscious, a repository of images, memories, mythologies, beings, archetypes that transcend individuals, that transcend cultures and time. And so, Dr. Jung would go through an alchemical process himself because Freud to him was very much a beloved mentor and father figure. But he also could not let go of his knowledge, of his conviction that the psyche was fundamentally mysterious, older than we can imagine, and far more intelligent than we are. Dr. Jung, your convictions go into mysticism, I dare say, was a frequent argument between him and Dr. Freud. And this led to them breaking apart. And this actually launched Dr. Jung into a semi-psychosis for about 3 or 4 years. Somehow, well, not somehow, he was very well supported, let's say. He had achieved world fame already. His wife, Emma Jung, was incredibly rich. So he had a lot of support to be able to keep seeing patients during this time when the psyche was very alive for him, when he was hearing the voices of the dead speak in his house, when his children were having dreams of the dead that were speaking to him, and as he was starting to encounter images like this one that he described in the Red Book. And so what Dr. Jung had met with in his breakup with Dr. Freud was the first stage of the alchemical process, which is the mortifactio, or the putreficatio, the death. And so this is the stage of the first half of life. If we bring Groff back into this, whatever ways we imprinted in our birth experience, whichever ways we closed off, that are then magnified, reinforced, conditioned in our early upbringing, we form an identity that is separate from the truth, from the true self. And this is at the core of the individuation process of becoming yourself, of finding yourself, of dying to who you thought you were, sitting on this black sun, the soul Niger. That part has to meet its inevitable conclusion, whether it takes place in your lifetime or whether it takes place with your physical death. And that's the danger when we don't embrace physical process. When we don't embrace inner process. Because then you can start to externalize this, as I did, as we discussed the first evening. I was undergoing a death. My limited ego identity was starting to fail. And rather than look at this as an inner process of which I needed to transform, I was externalizing that process into physical death. I must need to die. And so you've got to be met with this massive weight of seeing that you rest on a foundation of nothing. There is nowhere to stand. Everything that you thought you were was all based on relativity. Because it was based on relativity, it was not based on anything actually absolute and true. And so you go through the darkness of it, the negredo. This is the melancholia. This is the kind of the butterfly or the caterpillar turning into black goo before it becomes a butterfly. And this is often equated to the dark night of the soul. The dark night of the soul is actually a separate phenomenon. Because this process that we're about to describe, just like we described yesterday in the cycles of birth and death, we go through many cycles of birth and death throughout our entire lifetime. At least, ideally, we do. And the dark night of the soul is actually a very particular time at which point you have come to a level of consciousness where you are more or less in touch with and am embodying union with the divine, and then something happens, or just as suddenly as it was there, now it's gone, and you have actually tasted and experienced what it was like to be in that full identification or that full embrace of love with the divine, and now it's gone. So the dark night of the soul is actually a separate thing, and it's one of the final stages that you will go through on your way to, say, super integral consciousness. But this is the tough time. This is the expressing. This is where the idea of true and false sulfur comes in. Like we were saying, that's the fire element, yeah. So both of these sulfurs, they're what drives you. They're what motivates you. And so the false sulfur is that which only lives to be burnt, is the fire which lives only to burn itself out. It is all the little habits that we go through each day that are supporting our ego structure in some way, that as a boon or to keep it up. These are our escapists and addicts. This is gluttony. This is the 7 deadly sins: lust, envy, of finding a material means for a spiritual quench or for a spiritual thirst. And so the idea is to just let that false sulfur burn itself out. Burn itself out, and also start to contain it, because whenever we are burning that false sulfur, we're evaporating psychic or evaporating spiritual energy. And in order to progress further, we actually need to start to be able to contain that energy. And what did the alchemists do with this? It's very simple. They bottled it. Bottle it up. Now, that doesn't mean repress it. Doesn't mean don't pretend it's there. It means that you're fully embracing and experiencing whatever it is that is coming up, that pain that you feel, that compulsion that you want to act on, and you sit with yourself in meditation and you let that energy continue to build up. Because through that pain and through that suffering, you can actually use it to progress further through the process. And I'll give an example of a dream that I had in which this was put across to me. This will be another good opportunity to explore how our dreams are speaking to us in just a magnificent and perfect way. I'm contacted by a young woman, about 16 years old, whose father has just been murdered by a witch. And the witch is his wife and her mother. And she invites me over to their house. It's this very old, ancient structure, big stone staircase leading up to a study, the red carpet, the walls filled with books, the husband's study, where the witch cannot set foot. The witch cannot set foot within this room, within this study. And the way that this witch kills, or the way that this witch works her magic, is through possession. She will possess men, and she will lead them to their death. And so, with her help and the help of 2 compatriots, again, this is this idea of the 4, right? In the mandala, we have the squaring of the circle, which is the finite expression of the infinite. So this is the totality of me working through this. So with 2 male compatriots and this young anima figure, together, we're able to get the witch and put her in a bottle. We're all holding the bottle together and we're incanting something. It's in Latin, it's in a language I don't understand. And as we finish the incantation is to prevent her from possessing us when she gets out. We drop the bottle, it shatters, and the witch just kind of like wisps away and fades away, peacefully. as if it was a quiet death for her too. And so contained within all of that, we're going to take a more interpretive lens on that one, which was that this younger inner feminine part of me needs my help, needs my incantation, needs our incantation, our collective help, the help of the entirety of the personality for this unconscious element. And this witch, she was very haggy, gray, pale skin, black eyes, raggedy hair, very terrifying. But she can't go into the study. Why is that? It's due to the logos. And by taking her into putting her in a bottle, not pretending that she's not there, because in this clear vessel, this hermeneutic vessel, we might say, we can very much see her, but we're protected from it. And by speaking our words, by being intentional, not letting her possess us when she gets out, now the energy is free to die and take on a new form. Before we go further, I wanted to read this from Dr. Carl Jung, because we were discussing earlier how the unconscious seems very mysterious, whereas the ego seems very apparent. And he has something very interesting to say about that. It is therefore not surprising if the unconscious appears in projected and symbolized form, as there is no other way by which it might be perceived. But this is apparently not the case with consciousness. Consciousness, as the essence of all conscious contents, seems to lack the basic requirements for a projection. Properly understood, projection is not a voluntary happening. It is something that approaches the conscious mind from outside, a kind of sheen on the object, while all the time the subject remains unaware that he himself is the source of light which causes the cat's eye of the projection to shine. Luna is therefore conceivable as a projection, but soul as a projection, since it symbolizes consciousness, seems at first glance a contradiction in terms. Yet soul is no less a projection than Luna. This is the important part. For just as we perceive nothing of the real sun but light and heat, and apart from that, can know its physical constitution only by inference, so our consciousness issues from a dark body, the ego, which is the indispensable condition for all consciousness. The latter being nothing but the association of an object or a content, the ego. The ego, ostensibly the thing we know most about, is in fact a highly complex affair, full of unfathomable obscurities. Indeed, one could even define it as a relatively constant personification of the unconscious itself. Whoa. A more or less constant personification of the unconscious itself. So yeah, we think of ourselves as in control of our destiny sometimes, right? Or at least we like to think that. Yet, all the time, we move towards things that we say that we want, and we find ourselves hampered in different ways. Or we say, we're definitely not going to do that thing again. And then we do it 1,000 more times. So who's really running the show in all of this? So yeah, part of it is these subconscious sub-personalities split off from our own awareness, working themselves through these kind of hands that are marionetting us through life. And it's also, if we are a more or less constant personification of the unconscious, it is also the unconscious coming to know itself through a conscious being, or through a soul, through the conduit. Yeah. And soul, S-O-U-L and S-O-L, right? Sun, ego consciousness. Because how does it come to know itself? And so this process in Jungian psychology is known as confrontation with the shadow, which is the parts of ourselves that we least like to encounter and identify with. And most people, when they first encounter their shadow, if not all people, run away screaming. because it is not just the personal elements that we don't want to identify with, that we don't want to bring into our being, and for many good reasons, right? But it's also the transpersonal, the deep levels of evil that we are also part of. And so as a practical example, in this same sort of vein, because I was so identified with myself as a good guy, as a white knight, and as a savior, I was very unattuned to any level of myself as a selfish being. And I saw this played out in my first romantic partnership, which was intensely codependent, which was very abusive. And towards the end, my partner experienced a psychosomatic illness that doctors could not figure out, that sucked the soul out of both of our lives for a period of a few months. And it was so debilitating. She was bedridden and she could barely eat. And I figured myself such a good guy for just sticking through all of this. And I was confronted with the thought, man, if she dies, won't people just think so highly of me? Which was this was a pretty visceral thing to confront. Oof, such a good guy, huh? And so this is when you're really getting in touch with all those aspects of yourself, because you've died to that image of who you are. Now you're sitting in the putrid substance that you would not take into your own being, which is partially the reason why it's putrid. It's because you'll deny it. It's like a bog or a swamp that has no running water. It's just sitting there, fetid. No movement, no life, no consciousness. And as you start to bring the light of your awareness to that, that's where it can undergo transformation. And so I'll also use the analogy of the book of Job. This is a beautiful telling of kind of all the different parts of ourself, and kind of turns a lot of our conceptions on its head. So, if you don't know the story is that there's a man named Job. He's doing quite well. He praises God. He's a beloved figure in his community. He has a healthy family, flock, crops, all of it. And God and the devil are sitting together one day. And Satan says, you know, this Job guy, he praises you and everything, but I think it's only because everything's going really well for him. And I bet you, God, that if you take away all those good things that he has, he will curse you. So God says, okay. And he starts to take these things away. Now, this is what I really appreciate about different lenses on these stories, is that so often we're just told that the devil is just the bad guy, that he's evil incarnate. But what is he doing in this situation? It's what Alan Watts describes as the district attorney of heaven. He says, you know, he's got a blind spot here. There's actually something that's keeping him from more fully embracing you, which is that, yeah, things are going great for him. Of course he's praising you. But how about when all that's taken away? So, poor Job is visited upon by many misfortunes: the death of his children, the decimation of his crops and his flock, being ostracized from his community, who says, seems like you're not really such a pious man after all. Why would God do this to you? And he's brought to this place where he has nothing left. He's brought to the Negredo. He's experienced the death of himself in all directions. And he does curse God. He says, how could you do this to me? Well, it turns out that Job really thought highly of himself. He thought he was such a good guy. And in fact, the townspeople were getting really sick of his piousness and this feeling that he was better than all of them. which is the real reason why they ostracized him. And so God confers to Job this revelation, painted by the wonderful William Blake, which is that, behold, Behemoth and Leviathan, they are my creations. And so they are created for me, so they are a part of me. And you place yourself above them. So Job, do you place yourself above me? You place yourself above God? And then Job has the unitive, mind-blowing, psychedelic experience of becoming one with God and seeing all of these things come out. It's a very quick and very intense alchemical procedure where all the false sulfur is burned up in this revelation. And now the true sulfur, the soul work, what you were called into this lifetime, into this incarnation to do, takes place and takes root. And that's what moves you. And that true sulfur never goes out. Cannot be burned up. And so then you enter into the next stage, which is the albedo, or the purification, where you're starting to burn out these different parts of yourself. You've had the death. You've died to who you thought you were. You've sat with your shadow, sitting with your shadow, learning to embrace all the things that you were once terrified of embracing. And now you get to meet the other side of your psyche, the anima or the animus, depending if you are a masculine identified or a feminine identified being. The anima, of course, being the inner feminine within a masculine identified being, the animus being the inner masculine of a feminine identified being. Where you'll see these two show up the most is in romantic partnership. Because we're very good at interacting with ourselves, but there's two invisible partners within that relationship, which is the inner masculine of the feminine identified individual and the inner feminine of the masculine identified individual, both of which are much less mature than the personality. Because you have not given them that kind of energy, because we are socially conditioned in a certain way to take on these different roles or embrace different sides of ourselves. Male folks are driven more towards doing, towards not feeling. And so the feeling aspect gets much more cut off. Whereas, of course, I don't feel qualified to speak about what it's like to be a feminine identified being and how that's conditioned, because that was never my conditioning. But these two are the guides to the other side of your psyche, because they are, in some sense, a gatekeeper. For myself, my anima is the guide to my soul. She is the one that leads me throughout the lands of the unconscious. She is the one that has spoken to me when I have been in nature. She gets me in touch with my feelings, because you can kind of start to sense this in your own being when you become possessed by these different energies within you, whether it's the anima or the animus, whether it's different shadow aspects, whether it's the different subs that we talked about on Thursday. Because when you're being possessed by an addict, right, then all of your attention, all of your energy is focused on getting that, unless you're trying to bottle it up, in which case your energy and attention is focused on bottling up that energy and trying to use it towards a spiritual purpose of deepening your own awareness. And with regards to being taken over by an animus possession, of the inner masculine taking over, those are those opinions that you'll never let go. It doesn't matter. You can't reason with an animus. It's quite difficult for the masculine identified being, because he wants to reason with this part of his feminine partner. but that part of his feminine partner is obstinate and will not back down and does not listen to reason. He has reason of his own, tied to the unconscious. But as you start to be able to interact with these figures, as you start to, for those with an anima, to really start to embody and feel into your emotions and not be taken over by them. This doesn't mean don't feel them. That's the opposite of what I mean, because that's what we're so often taught to do. It means to feel them fully and then to move forward in action, not being possessed. So if you're feeling, say, sad and depressed, it is not to fall into a heap on the floor. It is to fall into a heap on the floor for a moment. To let yourself experience that, and then to move forward. And to interact with that part of yourself in a loving and compassionate way. So what subs are coming up with regards to this? How can you start to feel into your wounded children and give them what they need? What do they need? Do they need time to rest? Do they need a nourishing meal? Do they need a favorite meal that you had when you were a child? It can be a very powerful one. As regards to the animus, this is the deepening of awareness, the deepening of consciousness. This is coming to know the other sides of yourself. And also, in the same way, being able to channel the energy of your emotions towards a more conducive purpose, rather than just externalizing them or victimizing those around you, or whatever the case might be. And so we saw a little bit of an intonation in this in the dream that I shared yesterday, where I was following the old man and the woman. And in fact, in that order is exactly what this process would describe. Is the anima leads you to the wise old part of yourself, or the animus leads you to the wise old part of yourself. The part of you that sits outside of time, that knows you, that is infinitely interconnected to everything, which is how it's so wise. It's not necessarily a memory, it's a connection in the moment to everything else. This is just another depiction of the anima and animus, this kind of duality within us. And that brings you to the rubedo, to an awakening of the royal aspects of yourself. So as the shadow led us to our inner feminine or our inner masculine, this inner feminine and inner masculine is going to lead us to the royal part of ourselves, to the wise part of ourselves, just as it did in this dream. And what does the old man do? He jumps into the torrent, lets himself be carried by the stream. The anima follows right after him, and I follow right after her. This is an intonation that I'm doing something well, I suppose, in my life, because I'm following this intuition without questioning and having faith that whatever is going to happen is going to be conducive to my own growth. And so this was the wise old man of Jung's psyche. His name is Philemon. And through this completion, through this journey that you go on, like I said, this is a successive process. So we go through many phases, we go through many cycles, we're going to go through many different deaths. We're going to plant our identity somewhere. We're going to keep doing this until we become somatically and viscerally aware of the fact that there is nowhere to put our identity, because we keep putting it in things that we can name. We keep putting it in things that we can feel and see, all of these different arisings in consciousness that are not consciousness itself. Again, like we said the first night, if you can name it, it isn't you. And so, I wanted to do a visualization with y'all this evening to take you to your own lair, if you will. So everyone get in a comfortable position. Close your eyes. Start to breathe deeply into your belly. You can sit in a chair, you can lay down if there's room somewhere. Just don't fall asleep. Just taking some nice deep breaths down into the bottom of your belly. You're walking down a stone staircase that's spiraling to the left. You feel each step as you take it. It's lit by torches and many candles. The air is cool, but somewhat musty. And as you continue to walk down the steps, you get the sense that this is a place that you've been but haven't visited for a long time. And the staircase starts to gradually straighten out into a hallway, at the end of which is a great door. As you move closer towards the door, you see that it is ornately decorated with weavings of wrought iron vines. You put your hand onto the cold iron handle, and pulling the door open, you feel its immense weight. You see a bright light as you step into the room that lies behind the door. And inside this room is your own personal and perfect laboratory. It can be anywhere. It can be in a cave overlooking the ocean. It can be in a magnificent castle. Wherever your psyche has brought you, this is your perfect place, and it has all of the tools that you need to be able to work with the different parts of yourself. This might look like instruments. This might look like chemical apparati. It might look like fluffy pillows. And prurient toys. Just take a moment to breathe into this space and welcome it back home. You feel the texture of the floor and remember. This is a place just for you. And whenever you experience anything that we might describe as difficult or hard or terrifying, you'll take it, you'll bottle it up, and you'll run with excitement down this staircase into this space where you can work on this process in your inner sanctum, where you are the master, the alchemist, heating and cooling and distilling in whichever way is unique to you. These parts of yourself they're wanting to welcome home. Take a moment to brush some of the dust off the table, to extinguish the candles before you leave. And walk back towards the door, knowing that this place is available to you whenever you should need it. And as you close the door to your inner sanctum, to your inner laboratory, you run back up the stairs of the spiraling staircase, eager to find the different parts of you, those things that we might call difficult, to catch them with butterfly nets and flasks and bottles and bring them back to the lab. And as you're ready, just come back to the shared space. So this is a powerful tool to work with our inner alchemy. But of course, this would not be a revitalization of the collective soul if we were only doing inner alchemy. So, the goal of this process, the Mysterium Conjunctionis, the Hieros Gamos, the sacred marriage, of uniting the opposites within you, is not meant to be conducted in isolation. You do the inner work to do the outer work, to do the inner work, to do the outer work. And so, this is a becoming who you are, which I know so many of you are already doing. Not becoming who society told you who you should be, who your parents told you you should be and aspire to, but who you are, the emergent mystery that is you. This is the link to the source of your inner guidance, this wise figure in your psyche, like the figure that Olivia shared with us on Monday evening, or Thursday evening rather. The old woman who stays calm in the cyclone. She is the center of the cyclone, and not the cyclone itself. And here's the thing, as we all start to listen to this internal source, because we've been so enticed and encouraged and convinced by society that we really should pursue our desires and our self and our, for lack of a better word, aggrandizement. Our culture, in short, vehemently supports the burning of false sulfur because it's very lucrative. And perhaps it's tied in just with the elements of samsara, I don't know. The wheel that keeps going, the fire that only lives to burn itself out. Because the unique dispositions, talents, perceptions of every individual are needed. And they're not erroneous. They're not aberrant. They are particular to you, a gift. Can you imagine if we had a legion of saints running around? It would be awful. It'd be like a virus. The best sort of community is the ones where there are many different kinds of people. And so by performing this inner alchemy, by finding those different split off aspects of ourselves, our loyal soldiers, our addicts and escapists, our wounded children, and our shadows, by bringing ourselves home, we magnify the talents that we already have and burn away all the inhibitions and the fears that we've accrued through our collective conditioning as human beings throughout the ages. And so last night we were discussing the holographic nature of the universe. And I'm going to bring back this chart again. As we were discussing, we repeat the entire phylogeny of existence through our individual lives. So each individual goes through the full spectrum of time. As we were saying, life began on Earth in the primeval ocean, as little prokaryotes, as little simple unicellular organisms. And we begin our human lives as a unicellular organism in a salty solution. And then we progress to an invertebrate form, to a vertebrate, somewhat reptilian form, then a mammalian form, and then a human form. And not only that, as children, we go through all the different stages that our ancestors went through, which means that those structures are not given. They actually do have to be built, which means that our ancestors built different levels that we could then progress through. And so this puts us at a very interesting place in history, because those of us that are edging towards more integral levels of consciousness, that means that we are at the apex of the structure, and we get to build the structures that will come later. The ones that our children will just grow up through, like we grow up through magic and mythic stages. It will just be like breathing. This is the beautiful aspect of what it is that we do and how to use consciousness as a technology. Because there's some synthesis, there's something happening between the creation and the created, which helps it get closer and closer to the highest ideal. So this is a pretty wild thought. We have to make things conscious so that they can actually become programmed and unconscious. When we first learn to walk, we're very careful. We have to place a lot of conscious effort towards it, right? We haven't had to do that for a while. Now we can do all sorts of things and not have to think about it. When we first learned to write, we had to think about it a lot, to put a lot of conscious effort. But now, it's as natural as breathing. And so in that same way, we are progressing to the point where all of these things that we're talking about now will simply become like breathing. It will become apparent. We no longer really take it as a contest or that it's up for discussion that every single human being has the right to live on their own freedom. We know that that's not how it actualizes in the world, that people are still exploited and enslaved and prejudiced against. But we know deep in our hearts, and we don't have to question, that every human being has the same inherent value as everyone else. Whereas 200 years ago, in the at least as a consensus, as a modern consensus, you could definitely argue, and it is true, that there are people that don't believe that because they are at these other stages where they can't give that same selfhood that they experience to other people on whatever definition that they decide makes them unworthy. And so we're met with this world in which we're constantly going to be at different levels all the time. So it's not a matter of like, well, those damn mythically identified people, those people at the mythic stages, man, if they really got their act together, or the warlords in the world who very much see and feel and embody how much their personal power can go, or how far their personal power can go. There's not much that you're going to be able to do to convince that person who is enslaving people that they should really stop doing that, and that those people that they're enslaving have an inherent worth. So how do we do that grand alchemy with everything? How do we take in that shadow of ourselves? Because we know that we have that aspect of us. We know that we are capable of it. Or we should at least be intellectually curious around the fact that we can perpetrate great evil, especially when it's socially sanctioned. If I were to ask all of you to say, what probability do you think you would have been a Nazi in Nazi Germany? Most of us would say, probably not. Would hope not, right? But the fact of the matter is that everybody was doing it. Not only was everybody doing it, but there were consequences for not buying into that. And of course, there was a fair deal of subjugation or subterfuge. To some degree, the German citizens didn't know what was going on. But we could tie this to our own history as Americans, and the conversation that was had successively around the abolition of slavery. Which we're still dealing with the ramifications of today. But it does require that we acknowledge and become conscious of the fact that we have these parts within us. We have warlords within us. We have slave owners within us. We have the great feeling of having power over. Because it's only through knowing that part of yourself that you can even really do anything about it. And what do you do with that? How do you use that part of yourself? You use it to awaken others. Because those parts of yourself are very strong, very powerful, like Behemoth and Leviathan, right? They are these bastions of archetypal energy. And it's very good to have an unfuckwithable warlord inside of you when you're encountering a world in which there is so much nuance, complexity, and people at various stages of their development. And so the grand process, or the outer alchemy that takes place, is very similar to the inner, which is that it's an artistic creation of the moment. Like we were discussing, was it yesterday? Yes, yesterday. Moving body energy through the different channels of voice and movement, artistic expression, vision, rather than just keeping them tied up in thoughts. Of learning to work with our internal self as if it is a physical object, like the alchemists were doing. Because it really doesn't matter. These distinctions are useful at best for existing in the modern world. But when you start to practice with ritual, and you start to practice with magic, and you start to practice with alchemy, you realize that it doesn't really matter, that you're just kind of playing a game the whole time anyway. And so you have to find the process or the method that works for you in particular. And why does it work for you? And then as you start to become more and more and more of who you are, when you encounter inevitably these others who are at these stages, then you can be compassionate with them. And you don't actually have to know what it would be that would make that situation, or that would bring about a subsequent increase in consciousness for the both of you. Because you don't know. But there is a side of you that does. And that's the grace of it, is that we get to live our wonderful, short, finite lives connected to a wisdom that can guide us. And that's the vision I have, at least, for what we can do as a collective. It'll never be perfect. There will always be people that are hurting one another, that are not aware of the fact that there's an internal process happening, and so they will externalize it. They will blame others, they will kill others, they'll project their shadows onto groups of people, and then wars will happen. May even see this in the next few decades in our own world. So as these things start to happen, keep this in mind of what is going on. What is going on? Because no one ever really tries to look. They try to say, explain what's going on. But if we take that understanding and we can see these things play out, then we can just watch it. And through our being, wherever we are, listen to this deep inner seat of ourselves. And through that intelligence, that wisdom that is not our own, start to move even more forward, as we've been doing as a collective for thousands of years. All right, everyone. Well, thank you very much for being here. This concludes the Nature-Based Maps of the Psyche lecture series. It has been an absolute pleasure to speak with you all. And other than that, it is a delight and pleasure to know all of you and to have shared all of this with you over the last 3 nights. Be well, and I look forward to seeing you all around in the future. Thank you.